The DFI has reviewed your project. The financial model passes. The legal structure is sound. The sponsors have committed equity. The EPC contractor is procured. And then the DFI writes back, "We cannot proceed. The ESIA is inadequate. Community engagement does not meet IFC Performance Standard 1. The Resettlement Action Plan has not been independently verified. The grievance mechanism is not operational." Deal paused, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. This is not a hypothetical. We have seen it. And it is entirely preventable if you understand what the DFI requires before you start construction.
Zara, welcome to Episode 8 of AIB Corp Ltd. I think this topic is one that many developers genuinely underestimate. They focus on the financial model, the legal structure, the DFI engagement, and treat the ESIA as a compliance formality. Is that the mistake?
That is precisely the mistake. The ESIA is not a box-ticking exercise. It is your social and environmental license to operate. Without it, no DFI will disperse. And the consequences of getting it wrong are not just a failed credit committee. They are community opposition, legal injunctions, national media coverage, and reputational damage that can block you from future DFI financing. Episode 8 covers the full framework, what an ESIA is, all 8 IFC performance standards, the 6-stage process, and the 7 mistakes that delay financial close. An ESIA, Environmental and Social Impact Assessment, is a structured process to identify, predict, and manage the environmental and social impacts of an infrastructure project. It is mandatory for all DFI-financed projects. The legal basis varies. The IFC performance standards, which set the global benchmark, the African Development Bank's integrated safeguard system, the Equator Principles, adopted by commercial banks, and National Environmental Impact Assessment Law, which applies in parallel. The ESIA assesses the physical environment, biodiversity, communities affected, land use and access, labor conditions, and cultural heritage.
Who prepares the ESIA? I've seen developers attempt to write their own.
The DFI will not accept an ESIA prepared by the developer. It must be prepared by an independent ESIA consultant, a specialist firm with no financial interest in the project outcome. The consultant is selected through a competitive process and reports findings independently. The DFI categorizes projects by impact severity. Category A, significant, diverse, or irreversible environmental and social impacts, requires a full ESIA and often an independent review panel. Category B, limited impacts, may require only an environmental and social management plan. Most African infrastructure transactions in energy, water, and transport are Category A. The consequence of failing to commission a compliant ESIA is straightforward. No DFI financing, no exceptions. The IFC performance standards are 8 standards that together constitute the global benchmark for environmental and social management in project finance. All 8 apply to every DFI-financed project. Non-compliance with any single standard, not just the ESIA standard, can block financing. PS1 governs the overall assessment and management process. PS2 covers labor and working conditions. PS3 covers resource efficiency and pollution prevention. PS4 covers community health, safety, and security. PS5, the most complex for African projects, covers land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. PS6 covers biodiversity. PS7 covers Indigenous peoples. And PS8 covers cultural heritage.
That's a wide scope. A developer building a solar plant might think they only need to worry about environmental impacts, but PS2 through 5 affect almost every project regardless of sector.
Exactly. A 50-megawatt solar plant in East Africa might trigger PS1 for the full ESIA, PS2 because the EPC contractor employs construction workers, PS3 because of land clearance and waste management, PS4 because the construction camp is near a village, PS5 if any households are displaced from the site, PS6 if the land has natural habitat value, and PS8 if there are any archaeological features in the excavation zone. The developer who thinks the ESIA is only about the environment is already behind. Let me take you through each standard in detail. PS1 is the foundation. It governs the entire assessment and management process. The central requirement is that the developer identifies all environmental and social risks and impacts, applies the mitigation hierarchy, avoid first, then minimize, then mitigate, then offset, and documents binding commitments in an environmental and social management plan, the ESMP. PS1 also requires ongoing monitoring throughout construction and operations, reported to the DFI annually. The DFI classifies the project as Category A or B, and that classification determines whether a full ESIA or a simpler ESMP is required.
What is the mitigation hierarchy and why does the order matter?
The hierarchy matters because the DFI will check whether you genuinely attempted to avoid the impact before accepting it. Avoid means redesigning the project to eliminate the impact entirely. For example, moving the project footprint to avoid a sensitive habitat. Minimize means reducing the magnitude of the impact. Mitigate means managing residual impacts that cannot be eliminated. Offset, also called compensation, is the last resort, and it is only accepted when the first 3 steps have been genuinely exhausted. A developer who jumps straight to offset without demonstrating avoidance has not met PS1. PS2 covers labor and working conditions. It applies to all workers, direct employees, contractors, subcontractors, and supply chain.
Does PS2 apply to the EPC contractor's workers, or only the developer's own staff?
It applies to everyone working on the project, and the developer is responsible for ensuring the EPC contractor complies. This is a critical point. The EPC contractor must have written employment contracts for all workers, pay at or above national minimum wage, comply with ILO working hour standards, maintain an occupational health and safety management system, and operate a worker grievance mechanism. The developer must flow these requirements down into the EPC contract and verify compliance during construction. PS3 covers resource efficiency and pollution prevention, GHG emissions, water use, wastewater discharge, hazardous materials, waste management, air quality, dust, and noise.
GHG emissions. Is that relevant for African infrastructure projects? Most developers I speak to focus on the SIA for immediate local impacts, not climate.
It is increasingly relevant because DFIs are aligning to Paris Agreement commitments and publishing the GHG footprint of every transaction they approve. For renewable energy, this is straightforward. The project replaces fossil generation, and the emissions calculation is positive. For infrastructure with diesel backup, cement-intensive construction, or land clearance, the calculation is more complex. DFIs are also applying climate risk assessments. What happens to project revenues if the climate changes over the project life? PS4 covers community health, safety, and security. This is often underweighted by developers because it feels intangible, but it directly affects community acceptance and the social license to operate.
What specifically does PS4 require on security? That seems sensitive for projects in some African contexts where private security is common.
PS4 requires that private security personnel operate under the voluntary principles on security and human rights, a framework that prohibits excessive force, requires incident reporting, and mandates community engagement training for all security staff. In conflict-affected contexts, the requirements are significantly heightened. The DFI may require an independent security risk assessment. No engagement with non-state armed groups is permitted. Now, PS5. This is the most complex and most consequential performance standard for African infrastructure transactions. Land acquisition and involuntary resettlement.
Why is PS5 specifically so challenging in Africa?
3 reasons. First, land tenure in Africa is complex. Customary and informal land rights are prevalent, and people without formal title have the same protection under PS5 as those with registered title. Many developers discover informal occupants on their project site after financial close because they never commissioned a proper socioeconomic survey. Second, the Resettlement Action Plan, the RAP, must be approved by the DFI before any displacement takes place. And before any displacement, compensation must be paid and replacement land must be ready. If the RAP is not prepared until the DFI engagement stage, the critical path can add 18 months or more. Third, compensation is at replacement cost, not market value. That means the displaced household must be able to restore their living standards to at least pre-project levels. Cash payments alone are not sufficient if livelihoods were disrupted. The Livelihood Restoration Plan is a separate requirement. PS6 covers biodiversity conservation and the sustainable management of living natural resources. The standard classifies habitats as modified, already degraded by human activity, natural or critical. Critical habitat carries the highest requirements, no net loss of biodiversity, and an independent biodiversity survey conducted by a specialist consultant. Projects in or near IUCN protected areas face heightened scrutiny. Two categories of site make DFI financing practically unavailable: UNESCO World Heritage Sites and Ramsar wetlands. If your project is located in or adjacent to either, you will need independent legal and environmental counsel before approaching any DFI.
For the biodiversity survey, when in the project timeline should that be commissioned?
The biodiversity baseline survey must cover at least one full seasonal cycle, ideally 12 months, because different species and ecosystems present differently across wet and dry seasons. A survey conducted in a single season will be challenged by the DFI's environmental consultant. This is why PS6 is another reason the ESIA must begin at feasibility stage, not at DFI engagement. PS7 covers Indigenous peoples. The core requirement is FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. Where Indigenous peoples have a collective attachment to land or resources affected by the project, the developer must obtain their consent before proceeding with certain project activities.
FPIC is a concept that generates a lot of debate. Does it mean Indigenous communities have a veto over the project?
FPIC does not grant a veto in international law, but it is close to one in practice under IFC performance standards. If the FPIC process has not been completed, the DFI cannot approve the project. Free means consultation without coercion, no incentives tied to agreement. Prior means before project decisions are made, not after designs are finalized. Informed means full and transparent disclosure of all project impacts in a language and format the community can understand. The process is iterative. It continues through the project lifecycle. Identifying whether PS7 applies is a legal and anthropological question and should be assessed early with specialist expertise. In Africa, Indigenous peoples' identity is contextually complex and requires careful expert determination. PS8 covers cultural heritage.
Cultural heritage. What does that mean for a road or dam project where construction involves excavation?
PS8 requires the developer to commission an archaeological survey before any ground is broken and to have a chance finds protocol in place, a defined stop work procedure activated if heritage features are discovered during excavation. Cultural heritage includes tangible features like archaeological sites, historic structures, and burial grounds. Intangible heritage, including sacred landscapes and oral traditions, and living heritage, sites of ongoing cultural or religious significance to communities. Critical cultural heritage cannot be offset or traded. It must be avoided, or in extreme cases, relocated only with full community agreement and government notification. Now let me walk through the 6-stage ESIA process.
How long does a full SIA take for a typical African infrastructure project? Developers often ask me this, and I want to give them a realistic answer.
For a Category A project, a power plant, a dam, a highway, The full ESIA typically takes 12 to 18 months if scoping begins at feasibility stage. Stage 1 is scoping, defining the issues the ESIA must assess, consulting with the DFI on the terms of reference, and selecting the independent ESIA consultant. This takes 4 to 6 weeks. Stage 2 is the baseline survey, physical environment, biodiversity, socioeconomic survey, cultural heritage survey, and takes 4 to 6 months. Stage 3 is the impact assessment, predicting and rating each impact. Stage 4 is mitigation design and ESMP drafting. Stage 5 is public disclosure. The draft ESIA is disclosed for a minimum 60 days, and community meetings are held. Stage 6 is the final ESIA submission to the DFI, which then conducts its own independent review. The DFI review alone typically takes 3 to 6 months for a Category A project. The ESMP, Environmental and Social Management Plan, is the binding output of the ESIA. It is not a report, it is an action plan. For every identified impact, the ESMP specifies the mitigation measure, the responsible party, the implementation timeline, the key performance indicator, and the budget. The ESMP is incorporated into the DFI financing documents as a legal covenant. Breach of the ESMP is a covenant default. The DFI can withhold disbursement, require corrective action, or in severe cases, declare a technical default on the loan facility. The ESMP covers both construction, dust, noise, waste, worker camp management, and operations, including emissions monitoring, water discharge, and ongoing community engagement.
Is the ESMP budget included in the project CapEx and OpEx, or is it treated separately?
The ESMP budget must be included in the project financial model. Construction phase ESMP costs sit within project CapEx as owner's costs. Operations phase ESMP costs, monitoring, community liaison, biodiversity surveys, sit within OpEx. If the ESMP budget is absent from the financial model, the DFI will identify it as a gap in due diligence and may withhold approval of the first disbursement until the ESMP is fully funded. This is one of the 7 mistakes we cover later. Community engagement under PS1 requires what the IFC calls meaningful consultation. Meaningful is defined specifically. It does not mean informational meetings with community leaders.
What makes engagement meaningful versus what developers typically do?
Meaningful engagement is inclusive. It reaches women, youth, and vulnerable groups, not only elected leaders. It is conducted in the local language, with materials translated and meetings facilitated in the community's own tongue. It is free of coercion. No incentives are offered for agreement. It is documented. Attendance lists, topics raised, responses given, all formally recorded. And it is iterative. Engagement continues through the project lifecycle, not just during the ESIA phase. The DFI will review the stakeholder engagement record as a formal document. A thin record, 2 meetings with the chief, and a signature will trigger a request for additional engagement, which delays financial close. The grievance mechanism is directly linked to engagement. Every IFC standard project must have a functioning grievance mechanism accessible to all affected people, including workers.
What are the minimum operational requirements for a grievance mechanism that would satisfy a DFI?
The grievance mechanism must be accessible in the local language, with no literacy requirement. An oral complaint must be accepted, it must be confidential where the complainant requests it, and there must be no risk of retaliation for raising a complaint. Acknowledgement must happen within 5 days. Resolution within 30 days is the IFC standard. If not resolved, there must be a defined escalation path up to the DFI's own accountability mechanism. Every complaint must be formally logged: date, nature, response, resolution, outcome. The grievance log is submitted in the annual ESMP compliance report. The DFI may conduct unannounced site visits to verify the grievance mechanism is actually operational, not just documented on paper. Now, how do the different DFIs approach their ESIA review?
There are so many DFIs active in Africa: AfDB, IFC, BII, Proparco, DEG, FMO, OPIC, AIB. Do they all apply IFC performance standards?
They all align to IFC performance standards for private sector project finance in Africa, though each has its own framework. The AfDB applies the Integrated Safeguard System, 5 operational safeguards mapped directly to IFC performance standards. Category 1 projects require a full ESIA and an independent review panel. The AfDB also requires the ESIA to be disclosed on the AfDB website for 60 days before the board approves the project. IFC applies its own performance standards directly and produces an environmental and social review summary that is published publicly. BII, British International Investment, applies its own E&S policy, aligned it to IFCPS, and produces an E&S action plan that becomes a binding covenant. European DFIs, Proparco, DEG, FMO, apply the Equator Principles and engage an independent lender's environmental and social consultant to monitor ESMP compliance during construction. The developer must cooperate with that consultant unconditionally. Different sectors attract different dominant performance standards and have different ESIA timelines. Renewable energy, solar and wind, is typically Category A if above 50 megawatts or in a sensitive habitat area. The Biodiversity Baseline Survey is critical. For wind, avian flight path studies are mandatory. For solar, glint and glare assessments and visual impact surveys are required. The typical ESIA timeline for a utility-scale renewable energy project in Africa is 12 to 18 months. Water and sanitation projects, dams, treatment plants, distribution networks are almost always Category A. Hydrology baseline data covering multiple seasons is required, and the downstream impacts on water users must be assessed.
What about transport, roads and rail? Those are linear projects affecting communities across a long corridor.
Transport is the most complex ESIA category in Africa because the project is linear. It crosses multiple communities, multiple land tenures, multiple ecosystems, and multiple administrative jurisdictions. The Resettlement Action Plan for a road project can require individual agreements with hundreds of households. Cultural heritage chants finds along a road corridor are common, and the ESIA disclosure process must reach all affected communities along the full route, not just one. Typical timeline is 18 to 30 months. The RAP is frequently the critical path for financial close-on-road projects. Digital infrastructure is the simplest category, typically Category B with a 9 to 12-month ESIA timeline. But electromagnetic field assessments and community engagement on tower siting are still required. Now, the 7 ESIA mistakes that delay financial close in Africa.
Let me guess the first one, starting the ESIA too late.
Correct, and it is by far the most common. Developers who begin the ESIA at the DFI engagement stage are already 12 to 18 months behind. The ESIA must begin at feasibility stage. Mistake 2. The developer prepares the ESIA themselves to save cost. The DFI will reject it. The ESIA must be prepared by an independent consultant. Mistake 3. A weak baseline. A single dry season biodiversity survey accepted by the National EIA Authority will not satisfy the DFI's environmental consultant. Mistake 4. No resettlement survey. Informal occupants discovered after financial close trigger PS5 retrospectively. The RAP must be prepared before any construction begins. Mistake 5. Token community meetings. 2 sessions with the village chief, documented on 1 page. The DFI requires inclusive, iterative, documented engagement with all affected groups. Mistake 6. The ESMP is not in the project budget. This gets caught at financial model review and delays disbursement. Mistake 7. No grievance mechanism. This is a Day 1 covenant breach if discovered at the DFI's first site visit. At AIB Corp Ltd, ESIA process management and ESG compliance advisory are core services. We have supported developers through ESIA preparation, DFI disclosure processes, resettlement action plan design, community engagement programs, and ESMP development across energy, water, transport, and housing projects in sub-Saharan Africa.
What does AIB Corp Ltd provide for a developer who needs to commission or manage an ESIA?
We manage the full ECA process, from drafting the terms of reference and selecting the independent ESIA consultant, through to reviewing the draft ESE against IFC performance standards requirements. Before it is submitted to the DFI, we identify which performance standards apply and what specific deliverables are needed. We design the community engagement program to IFC PS1 Meaningful Consultation Standard. We develop the ESMP with KPIs, budget, and a DFI standard monitoring framework. And where PS5 applies, we support the Resettlement Action Plan design and the independent verification process. Our work is structured to the specific DFI you are approaching, AfDB, IFC, BII, or a European bilateral, because their review processes differ.
And the bottom line for any developer listening who is planning to approach a DFI?
Commission your ESIA at feasibility stage. Select an independent consultant. Begin the baseline surveys before you have finalized the project design, so you can still change the footprint to avoid a sensitive area if the baseline reveals one. Build the ESMP budget into your financial model. Design the community engagement program with an expert who understands IFC PS1. And have your ESIA reviewed against DFI standards by an experienced transaction advisor, AIB Corp Ltd, before you submit it. The ESIA is the social license for your project. Build it correctly the first time. Details at due.aibcorpltd.com.
Zara, this has been the most comprehensive treatment of the African infrastructure ESIA I have encountered in one session. Let me summarize the core message. The ESIA is not a compliance document. It is the social and environmental license for the project. Without a compliant ESIA, no DFI will disperse. All 8 IFC performance standards apply to every project, and compliance with all 8 is required simultaneously.
The ESIA process has 6 stages and takes 12 to 18 months for a Category A project, which is why it must begin at feasibility, not at DFI engagement. The ESMP is a binding legal covenant in the financing documents. Community engagement must be meaningful, inclusive, documented, and iterative. The Grievance Mechanism must be operational on day 1 of construction. And the 7 mistakes: late start, developer-led ESIA, weak baseline, missing resettlement survey, token engagement, unbudgeted ESMP, absent Grievance Mechanism, are all preventable.
The insight that lands for me is that the ESIA determines whether affected communities support the project. And community opposition can block a project that has otherwise secured its financing. That social license is not a document. It is the outcome of a genuine engagement process.
That is the point precisely. A DFI will not lend to a project that is opposed by the communities it affects, regardless of how strong the financial model is. The developer who invests in genuine, early, inclusive community engagement is the developer whose project closes on schedule. The developer who treats the ESIA as a formality is the one calling us 12 months after financial close was missed, asking how to recover the process. We prefer to be involved at the start.
If you need SIA process management, ESG compliance support, or a PS review for your African infrastructure project, go to www.aibcorpltd.com. AIB Corp Ltd manages SIA processes and ESG compliance for African infrastructure transactions across energy, water, transport, housing, and digital infrastructure. Confidential initial consultation available.
Subscribe to the AIB Corp Ltd channel. New episode every week. Episode 9 covers the African Infrastructure Offtake Agreement, the PPA, the OSA, and government offtake structures. We will cover what makes an offtake bankable, how tariff structures are negotiated, take-or-pay floors, term lengths, termination provisions, and how DFIs assess offtake credit risk.
If this episode was useful, share it with a developer who is preparing for a DFI submission. The ESIA is the one area where early action has the highest return. Getting it right costs less than getting it wrong. See you in episode 9.
One final point. The ESIA is required for DFI financing, but it is also increasingly required by commercial banks applying the Equator Principles, by private equity funds applying ESG due diligence, and by institutional investors applying responsible investment frameworks. A credible ESIA does not just unlock DFI financing, it unlocks the full capital stack. Build it to the highest standard, and it will serve every capital source you approach. AIB Corp Ltd. www.daibarpolity.com